I was reading my nephew's eulogy for my brother when I realized he'd been stealing from me for 2 years. Let me back up. My name is Robert Callahan. I'm 63 years old, and I spent 31 years building something most people in Denton County, Texas, never knew existed. I'm not famous. I don't go to galas. I drive a 10-year-old Ford F-250 and I eat lunch at the same diner every Tuesday. But quietly, methodically, the way my father taught me to do everything, I built Callahan Land and Timber into one of the most respected property management firms in North Texas. 46 commercial leases, 82 residential units, a timber operation on 400 acres outside Gainesville, combined value somewhere around $28 million. My nephew Kyle didn't know any of that. He thought I was a lucky rancher who'd inherited good land and stumbled into a little rental income. He thought I was the same Uncle Robert, who used to take him fishing every summer, who showed up to his high school graduation with a card and $50, who never talked about money because I didn't think it was anybody's business. He thought, when my brother Dennis had his stroke last October, that I was just a grieving old man who needed help. That was his mistake. Here's what happened, and I'm going to tell it straight because the truth is enough. Dennis had his stroke on a Wednesday morning. He was 61, healthy by every measure we could see, coaching youth baseball on Tuesday night and gone by Wednesday afternoon. The doctors said it was catastrophic, hemorrhagic stroke, the kind that doesn't give you a warning. I drove 4 hours from Gainesville to Dallas Medical Center, and I sat in that waiting room for 11 hours. Kyle was already there when I arrived. He hugged me at the door, tears in his eyes, genuine ones, I think. He was 34, worked in commercial lending at a regional bank, made decent money, drove a new Tahoe. He'd always been ambitious, even as a kid. Dennis used to brag about him at every family dinner. "Uncle Robert," he said, "I'm so glad you're here. I don't know what to do." Neither did I, honestly. Dennis and I weren't estranged, but we weren't close the way brothers on TV are close. We talked on the phone once a week. We had Christmas together. We respected each other. And he was the only family I had left besides Kyle. Dennis died on a Saturday, 4 days after the stroke. He never regained consciousness. I went home to Gainesville to handle my own grief in my own way, which mostly meant long drives on county roads and too much coffee and not enough sleep. I asked Kyle to help manage Dennis's estate while I recovered. Dennis had a modest house in Frisco, a truck, some savings, nothing complicated. Kyle was the executor. I should have paid closer attention. 6 weeks after Dennis died, I got a call from my accountant, a woman named Helen Cross who'd been doing my books for 15 years. She was careful, methodical, never called unless something was wrong. "Robert," she said, "I need you to come in." I drove down that afternoon. Helen had a stack of papers on her desk, and she looked like she hadn't slept. "Your business account," she said. "Someone's been making withdrawals." I sat very still. How much? Over the last 8 months, approximately $340,000. Small amounts, spread across different accounts. The kind of pattern that's designed not to trigger alerts. 8 months, I said. That meant it started before Dennis died. Before the stroke, before the funeral, before any of this. Someone had been inside my accounts for 8 months. "Do you know who has access?" she asked. I thought about it. I'd added Kyle to a secondary operating account the previous spring, during a period when I'd had a knee surgery and needed someone I trusted to handle routine vendor payments while I recovered. It was a limited authorization. Pay the bills, nothing else. But Kyle had a finance background. He knew what he was doing. "I think I do," I said. Helen nodded slowly. "There's something else. The withdrawals correlate with deposits into an LLC that was registered in Delaware 8 months ago. I had my paralegal pull the incorporation papers. She slid a document across the desk. The LLC was called Denton Ridge Properties. The registered agent was Kyle. I didn't say anything for a long moment. I looked at the document. I thought about Kyle crying in that hospital waiting room. I thought about my brother. "Helen," I said, "don't touch anything, don't call anyone. And I need you to help me understand exactly how deep this goes." It took her 3 days. Kyle hadn't just taken money from the operating account. He'd used his temporary access as a springboard to understand my business structure. Over 8 months, he'd learned exactly which of my properties were held under which entities. He'd identified 4 parcels, 2 vacant commercial lots in Denton, a warehouse in Sanger, and a 40-acre tract outside Decatur that were generating minimal current income. Then he'd started quietly contacting buyers. The warehouse had already sold, closed escrow 2 weeks after Dennis's stroke while I was driving county roads and grieving. Kyle had used a forged limited power of attorney notarized with a stamp I later discovered he'd ordered online for $11. The buyer was legitimate, just a logistics company that needed storage space. They had no idea. The sale price was $480,000. The money had gone directly into Denton Ridge Properties. The 2 commercial lots were under contract. Both deals were scheduled to close within the next 30 days. The 40-acre tract had been listed quietly through a brokerage in Wise County. I sat with all of this for 1 full night. My kitchen table, a yellow legal pad, and a cup of coffee that went cold. I wrote down everything I knew, everything Helen had found, every number, every date. And then I started thinking about the brokerage. The warehouse sale had been handled by a firm called Lone Star Commercial Group. I knew that name. I'd known it for 11 years because Lone Star Commercial Group was a subsidiary of Callahan Land and Timber. I had acquired them quietly in 2014 during a market dip, kept the existing management in place, let them operate under their own name. They handled commercial transactions throughout North Texas. Most of their clients had no idea who owned them. Kyle had used my own brokerage to sell my own warehouse. He paid them a commission check that came right back to my holding company. I almost laughed. Almost. My attorney, a man named Douglas Merritt, who I'd worked with for 22 years, came over the next morning with coffee and a legal pad of his own. "Walk me through it again," he said. I did. When I finished, Douglas was quiet for a moment. "The power of attorney is forged," he said, "which means the warehouse sale is voidable. You may be able to unwind it." "I know. The pending contracts on the lots, we can file an injunction and kill those before they close." "I know that too. So what are you waiting for?" I looked at him. "Kyle's been planning something for 6 weeks. He's been telling people in our family, our extended family, that I asked him to manage my assets while I was dealing with Dennis's death. That it was my idea. That I was overwhelmed, and he stepped in." Douglas set down his coffee. "How do you know that?" "My cousin Patrice called me last week. She said she was proud of how close Kyle and I had gotten, that it was beautiful how he was helping me get my affairs in order." I didn't say anything. I just listened. "So he's already building a cover story." "He's been building it for months." Douglas thought for a moment. "There's a family dinner next month. Your brother's memorial gathering, right? The one Kyle is organizing." Dennis had wanted a celebration of life rather than a funeral, and Kyle had taken it upon himself to plan it. 70 or 80 people, Dennis's friends and colleagues, family, from 3 states. A catered event at a venue in Frisco. "Kyle asked me to say a few words," I said. Douglas looked at me carefully. "Robert, I'm going to say a few words. This is going to be nuclear. I know what I'm doing." I spent the next 3 weeks being very quiet and very busy. First, I contacted Lone Star Commercial Group's actual managing director, a man named Ted Faulkner, who'd been with them since before I bought the company. I explained the situation. Ted was horrified. He pulled every document from the warehouse transaction and confirmed what Helen had already found. The power of attorney had cleared their junior associate, a recent hire who hadn't cross-referenced the authorization against my master file. They had security footage of Kyle in their office on 3 separate occasions. Then I called a forensic accountant named Raymond Chu, who came highly recommended by Douglas. Raymond tracked every dollar from the operating account withdrawals through Denton Ridge Properties. What he found was this. Kyle had spent approximately $200,000 of the money already. A new bass boat, upgraded Tahoe, several trips, a substantial down payment on a condo in uptown Dallas. The remaining $140,000 was sitting in the Denton Ridge Properties account, waiting for the warehouse sale proceeds to join it. The warehouse money, all $480,000, had been partially deployed. Kyle had made some legitimate-looking investments, the kind that looked good on a spreadsheet but moved slowly. About 300,000 was still accessible. The rest had been absorbed into lifestyle spending over 6 weeks. I called my doctor, a man I've seen for 20 years, and asked him to pull my medical records from the knee surgery the previous spring, specifically the period when I'd granted Kyle the limited account access. I wanted documentation of exactly what I'd authorized and what I hadn't, and I hired a retired sheriff's deputy named Morris Green, who did private investigation work to document Kyle's current spending patterns. Morris was thorough. He photographed the boat, he documented the condo, he pulled the purchase records on the Tahoe, showing it had been paid for in cash from a Denton Ridge Properties account. By the time the memorial dinner arrived, I had 4 banker's boxes in the trunk of my truck. The venue was a nice place in Frisco, a private room at a steakhouse Dennis had loved. Round tables with white tablecloths, a photo display of Dennis's life near the entrance, about 75 people, his old colleagues from the construction company where he'd worked, cousins from Arkansas and Oklahoma, neighbors, friends. Kyle had done a genuinely good job with the arrangements. I'll say that. He greeted me at the door. Firm handshake. "Uncle Robert, you doing okay?" "I'm doing fine," I said. "You put together a beautiful evening. Least I could do for Dad." His eyes got a little red. Genuine grief, probably. People are complicated. I found my seat and spent the first hour talking to Dennis's old friends, people I hadn't seen in years. His former foreman from the construction company, a big man named Garrett, who talked about Dennis's work ethic for 20 minutes. Dennis's neighbors from Frisco, a couple who'd brought a casserole to Kyle's place after the death. His college roommate who'd flown in from Portland. Kyle circulated the room playing host. He was good at it. Charming, warm, organized. He'd inherited Dennis's social ease. I watched him, and I thought about how Dennis would feel about all of this, and I found it hard to finish my dinner. After the main course, Kyle tapped his glass. "Before we do our toasts, I want to give the floor to my Uncle Robert," he said. "He's the family patriarch now. Uncle Robert, do you want to say something about Dad?" 75 people turned to look at me. I stood up. I took a breath. Dennis was the kind of man who could walk into a room full of strangers and leave with a dozen friends, I said. He worked hard his whole life. He showed up. He was generous with his time and his loyalty, even when it cost him something. He didn't talk much about what things were worth in dollars. He measured things differently. I paused. He taught me that the way you handle money is a reflection of your character. Not how much you have, how you treat it, where it comes from, what you're willing to do to get it. I looked at Kyle. I've been thinking about that a lot lately. The room was quiet in the way rooms get when they sense something shifting. "Kyle," I said, "you've been telling people that I asked you to manage my assets during my grieving, that I was overwhelmed and needed help." He looked at me very steadily. "Uncle Robert, I'm going to ask you something directly, in front of your father's friends and your family." I kept my voice level. "Did I authorize you to sell my warehouse in Sanger?" A beat of silence. "We can talk about this privately. Did I authorize you to execute a power of attorney in my name?" Another beat. "Uncle Robert, you were going through a very difficult time. I'm going to show everyone something," I said. I reached down to the briefcase I'd placed beside my chair before dinner. I laid 4 documents on the table in front of me. "This is the power of attorney used to sell my warehouse. My signature." I held it up. "And this is a sample of my actual signature, notarized, from a document signed the same week at my attorney's office. Douglas, would you come up here?" Douglas Merritt, who'd been sitting 3 tables over with a glass of iced tea, stood up and walked to the front of the room. "I can confirm," he said simply, "that these signatures do not match. The power of attorney is a forgery." The room erupted in murmuring. "This is the bank record," I said, holding up the next document, showing $340,000 withdrawn from my operating account over 8 months, traced by a forensic accountant to an LLC called Denton Ridge Properties. I held up the incorporation papers. This LLC was created by Kyle. Kyle had stopped saying anything. He was very still. "This," I said, holding up the last document, "is the commission statement from the warehouse sale. 4% commission paid to Lone Star Commercial Group." I set it down. Lone Star Commercial Group is a subsidiary of Callahan Land and Timber. I looked out at the room. Some people were confused. Most were starting to understand. My nephew used my own brokerage company to sell my own property. He paid a commission that came back to my own holding company. He stole from me using the tools I built. Absolute silence. One of Dennis's old colleagues, Garrett the foreman, said quietly, "Lord." Kyle's girlfriend, a woman he'd brought to the dinner, touched his arm and he moved slightly away from her touch. "I want to be clear about something," I said. "I didn't stand up here tonight to embarrass anyone at a memorial dinner. I stood up here because Kyle has already told this room, many of you personally, that I asked him to do this, that it was my idea, that I was struggling, and he helped me." I looked around the tables. "I'm standing here to tell you that is not true. And I wanted to tell you that in the same room where he told you the lie." I sat down. The room stayed quiet for a long moment. Then Dennis's college roommate started crying softly. Not about Kyle, just about Dennis, and somehow that broke the tension into something more human. Kyle left before dessert was served. At the police station the next morning, I sat across from a detective named Shaw who specialized in financial crimes. I handed her the 4 bankers' boxes. She opened the first one, looked at the top document and said, "How long did it take you to put this together?" "About 3 weeks." She looked at the boxes. "Mr. Callahan, most financial crime victims come in here with a shoebox and a phone screenshot." "I've been in business a long time," I said. "Documentation is everything." Kyle was arrested 48 hours later. The charges: felony theft over $200,000, forgery of a legal instrument, and financial exploitation of an elderly person. That last one bothered me a little. The word elderly, but my attorney said it was the right charge and it carried the right weight. His bail was set at $300,000. He made it, barely, with help from his mother, Dennis's ex-wife, who called me twice that week. I didn't answer. I wasn't ready. The pending contract sales on the commercial lots were killed by injunction within a week. The warehouse sale was more complicated. The buyer had already taken possession. But because the power of attorney was demonstrably forged, the transaction was voidable, and we began the process of either unwinding it or pursuing the proceeds through a civil judgment. Douglas said we'd recover most of it one way or another. The 40-acre tract listing in Wise County was quietly withdrawn. 3 months after the arrest, Kyle accepted a plea agreement. He pled guilty to felony theft and forgery, agreed to full restitution, and was sentenced to 4 years in state prison with the possibility of parole after 22 months. The judge noted the exploitation of a family member during a period of grief as an aggravating factor. I sat in the courtroom and watched them lead him out. He looked smaller than I remembered. He'd lost weight. He didn't look at me. Dennis's college roommate was there. He shook my hand after and said he was sorry. I told him it wasn't his fault. He said he knew, but that he was sorry anyway. I appreciated that. The restitution order was substantial. Kyle's condo in Uptown, which he'd purchased with stolen funds, was seized and sold. The boat went to auction. The upgraded Tahoe, most of what he'd spent on lifestyle in 6 weeks, was recaptured through asset forfeiture. The forensic accounting had made it simple to trace. What remained of the gap, Douglas estimated we'd recover through the warehouse transaction civil process. About 4 months after sentencing, I drove out to the 40-acre tract outside Decatur. I'd been meaning to get out there and just hadn't. It's pretty land, gently rolling, some cedar breaks, a seasonal creek in the back corner. Dennis and I used to talk about hunting it together someday. We never did. I sat on the hood of my truck and looked out over the pasture for a while. The truth is, the money wasn't the thing that hurt most. $340,000 is real money, but it wasn't going to break me. What I kept thinking about was Kyle standing in that hospital waiting room with tears in his eyes. Genuine tears. I believed they were genuine. And somewhere between that moment and 8 months of careful, calculated theft, something had happened in him that I didn't understand and probably never would. Dennis would have been destroyed by this. Maybe it was a small mercy that he didn't have to know. Helen Cross sent me an email that fall. She'd been contacted by a banking compliance officer who'd heard about the case and wanted to use the forensic accounting documentation as a training example for financial exploitation detection. She asked if I'd be willing to let them use the case, anonymized. I said yes, if it helped someone else catch something earlier. That was worth something. My cousin Beatrice called me about 2 months after the sentencing. She'd been awkward with me since the memorial dinner. Guilty, I think, for being one of the people Kyle had told his story to. "Robert," she said, "I owe you an apology." "You don't," I said. I believed him. He was convincing. And he was Dennis's son. That's not stupidity, Patrice, that's trust. She cried a little. I told her it was all right. It mostly was. I updated my estate documents that winter. Every authorization, every access level, triple-checked. Douglas now requires 2 independent verifications for any transaction above $10,000 flagged to my personal accounts. Helen has a direct line to him if she sees anything that doesn't look right. The tools you build can be turned against you. I know that now in a way I didn't fully understand before. So you build better tools. 6 months into his sentence, Kyle sent me a letter. It was handwritten, 3 pages, careful. He said he'd been going through a financial counseling program at the facility. He said he'd started to understand what he'd done, not just legally, but to the people involved. To me, to Dennis's memory. He said the grief after his father's death had not been an excuse, but that it had been real, and that somewhere in the fog of it, the access to my accounts had started to feel like something he was owed. He wrote that sentence, and then crossed it out, and wrote it again, like he wanted to make sure I knew he understood how wrong it was. He asked if he could write again. I held the letter for a long time. I thought about Dennis. I thought about what Dennis would have wanted. I wrote back a week later. I told Kyle that I would read whatever he sent. I told him that trust is not a thing you inherit. It's a thing you build over years of showing up correctly, and that he would have to start from the very beginning if he ever wanted any part of it back. I told him that the door wasn't closed, but that it was his to open, and it would take longer than he thought, and that was appropriate. I told him that I hoped he was learning something that actually mattered. I drove back out to that 40-acre tract in the spring. The cedar was green, and the creek was running after a good March rain. I'd started thinking about building something out there, nothing elaborate. A small cabin, somewhere quiet. Dennis would have liked that, I think. I'm not a man who talks about himself much. 30 years of building something, and most of my neighbors still think I'm just a rancher with some rental houses. That's how I wanted it. The quiet work speaks for itself eventually. Sometimes it speaks in ways you don't anticipate. In courtrooms, in forensic accounting files, in commission statements paid to your own subsidiary by the person who thought they were stealing from you. Sometimes the best answer to a lie isn't an argument. It's documentation, patience, and the right moment to simply tell the truth. If you made it to the end of this, thank you for listening. I'm not sure I had a lesson to teach when I started talking. But maybe this is it. Know what you built. Protect it. And if someone tries to take it from you by pretending you don't understand your own affairs, remember that the quietest people in the room are sometimes the ones who have spent 30 years understanding exactly that. I've thought a lot about what actually happened in this story. Not the legal part, not the money part, the part that started long before Kyle ever touched my accounts. For 30 years I kept my head down and built something real. I didn't talk about it. I didn't show it off. And somewhere in that silence, I created a blind spot. Kyle looked at me and saw a quiet old rancher who'd gotten lucky. He saw someone who wouldn't notice, someone who couldn't fight back. He wasn't born thinking that. It developed slowly, in the absence of information and the presence of assumption. I'm not saying that excuse is a single thing he did. It doesn't. But I've been honest enough with myself to admit that I contributed to the conditions that made it possible. That's the first thing I'd want anyone to take from this. The people in your life build their picture of you from what you show them. If you never show them the full picture, they'll fill in the gaps themselves. And sometimes what they fill in is dangerous. The second thing is about what Kyle actually did and why it collapsed so completely. He moved fast. He was confident. He had access, he had financial knowledge, and he had a grief-fobbed uncle who he assumed wouldn't be paying attention. Every single advantage he had was real, but he built the whole structure on a foundation that didn't belong to him. And when that foundation was examined clearly, everything above it came down at once. That's not bad luck. That's cause and effect working exactly the way it's supposed to. You cannot build something lasting on something you took. The speed doesn't matter. The sophistication doesn't matter. What holds up over time is what was honestly earned. The 3 weeks I spent building that case, going through the documents with Helen, sitting with Douglas, waiting while Raymond traced every transaction, those weeks were hard. I won't romanticize them. There were nights I sat in my kitchen and just felt tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. Tired of what people are capable of doing to each other. Tired of what grief can do to judgment on both sides of a situation like this. But I also want to say this. I'm glad I was patient. Every instinct I had in the first 48 hours told me to pick up the phone and confront Kyle directly. And if I had, I'd have tipped him off, given him time to move money, given him a story to tell. Patience wasn't weakness. It was the most powerful tool I had. If you're in something like this, or if someone you love is, the single most important thing I can tell you is to document before you act. Get to an attorney before you say a word to the person who wronged you. The emotional confrontation feels necessary. I understand that, I felt it too, but it costs you leverage. You can never get back, and if you're reading this thinking about Kyle, thinking it's sad that a young man ended up where he did, I think that too sometimes. He was Dennis's son. He sat with me in a hospital waiting room and cried real tears. He isn't a cartoon villain. He's a person who made a series of choices that compounded into something he couldn't walk back from. I wrote back to his letter. I told him the door wasn't closed. I meant it, but I also meant what I said about trust being something you build one honest day at a time, starting from zero. There are no shortcuts on that road. Kyle knows that now. I hope it sticks. What I know is this. The quietest kind of strength is the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. It just holds. And when someone tests it, thinking it isn't there, it turns out to be the only thing left standing.